They arrived before dawn, calm, composed, and dressed like they belonged in the world they had every right to step into. A black couple and their young daughter entered the first-class terminal of an elite airline, unaware that every smile they wouldn't receive and every extra question they'd be asked had already been decided the moment they were seen. Nothing was shouted, but everything was said. The welcome others received turned into suspicion for them, comfort turned to scrutiny, and policy became a weapon of humiliation dressed in professionalism. They didn't demand attention. They didn't raise their voices. But they were watched as they were denied, delayed, and slowly erased, row by row, interaction by interaction. No one stood up for them. No one intervened, until one careless moment revealed what no one expected, and what had been hidden in plain sight all along. If you've ever felt the weight of being judged before being known, this story is yours too. Hit like if you've seen the silent side of injustice. Subscribe to follow every second of this unraveling, and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? And how long did it take for you to realize something was wrong? At exactly 6:41 a.m., the Alaric family approached the Skylux first-class check-in counter at Trillium International Airport, rolling quietly toward the marble desk beneath the soft glow of pendant lights. Elandra, dressed in a muted graphite silk blouse and tailored cream pants, held her daughter Lyra's hand while Dorian walked just behind, his hand firmly on the matte black handle of their sleek Samsonite carry-on. Their presence was unassuming, dignified, and calm, the kind that often went unnoticed until someone took a longer look, and then made a decision based not on facts, but on assumptions. As they reached the front of the VIP line, the representative on duty, a sharp-nosed woman in her early 40s named Karen Harris, glanced up from her tablet with thinly veiled hesitation. Her lips pressed together in a faint line, and her eyes flicked from Lyra's small glittery shoes to Dorian's dark skin, then settled briefly on the family as a unit before she stepped away from the counter, picked up a walkie-talkie, and murmured something indistinct while gesturing toward the escalator behind them. When she returned, her smile was present in form only, stretched and empty. "I believe you're in the wrong area," she said crisply, her tone professional but hollow. "Family or group bookings are handled downstairs in the Economy Group Services Lounge. It's marked in green, hard to miss." Dorian, who had stopped mid-step, responded evenly. "We're flying first class. Flight 742. These are our boarding passes." He extended his phone calmly, where the screen displayed 3 separate QR codes clearly labeled Ether Air Skylux. Karen took the phone with forced politeness, but turned it over to retrieve a slim ultraviolet scanner from beneath the counter. "We've had some misunderstandings lately," she said, waving the scanner slowly across the screen. "Can't be too careful. Some folks think a screenshot with a fancy font is enough to bluff their way in." Her laugh was dry, brittle, and intended to land somewhere between suspicion and insult. The scanner beeped 3 times, clear, verified. No issues. Yet she lingered, staring at the screen as if hoping for an error to appear out of thin air. "Very well," she muttered, sliding the device back into the drawer without making eye contact. "You're good to proceed. Skylux Lounge is at the far end of the concourse." She pushed a button to lift the velvet rope, her movement perfunctory, dismissive, and void of any standard courtesy typically reserved for first-class clientele. No welcome aboard. No enjoy your flight. No eye contact. No warmth. Just the silent message. You don't belong here, and I intend to make sure you feel it. As the family entered the exclusive terminal lounge, another white couple in matching monogrammed polos approached the counter. Karen's expression lit up like stage lights as she leaned forward and chirped, "Mr. and Mrs. Talcott. Always a pleasure to see you. Champagne again today." Behind the thick soundproof glass of the lounge, the air was filled with the scent of bergamot and aged wood. Plush leather chairs circled crystal coffee tables, and low jazz pulsed through hidden speakers. A barista behind a stone-topped espresso counter greeted them with a nod, but no offer. Elandra guided Lyra to an armchair near the children's section and took a seat beside her, pulling out a coloring book and a soft pack of colored pencils from her tote. Dorian remained standing. He watched the tarmac through the panoramic window, arms folded, jaw tight, his own reflection staring back at him. He wasn't surprised. Not really. This wasn't the first time they'd been quietly told you're not the kind we expected. And it wouldn't be the last. He turned his head slowly to Alandra and said, under his breath, "That's why I told you not to request the greeting team." Alandra, whose voice was always low and level in public, replied without looking up from Lyra's drawing, "We didn't ask for special treatment. Just respect." She paused, glanced at her daughter, then added more softly, "But they still see us as intruding, even when we play by every rule." Meanwhile, across the lounge, a man in a navy suit spilled his latte on a leather armchair. A staff member rushed over with a towel and a replacement cup within seconds. No one came when Lyra quietly asked for orange juice from the refreshment table. Alandra ended up pouring it herself, careful not to leave fingerprints on the marble. Every interaction was civil, every smile polite, but the space around them grew colder by the minute, as if invisible walls were being raised 1 inch at a time. 40 minutes later, the boarding announcement echoed softly across the room. Ether Air Flight 742 to Montreal now boarding. All Skylux passengers may proceed to Gate 7A. As they approached the gate, a new line formed behind a platinum rope barrier. Rebecca Langley, the lead flight attendant, stood scanning boarding passes with a fixed smile that brightened and dimmed based on who stepped forward. To the elderly man in a bespoke tan blazer, she offered, "Welcome back, Mr. Granger, always a pleasure." To the middle-aged couple with matching Rimowa luggage, "Your seats are waiting. 3rd row on the left." But when Dorian stepped forward and presented his phone, her smile flattened. Her voice remained polite but dropped an octave. "Let me see that again," she said. She turned the screen slightly toward the overhead scanner and frowned. "I think this is a coach seat. Did you get an upgrade at the counter?" "No," Dorian said quietly. "This was booked directly. Skylux, 3 tickets." "Well, the system doesn't always update right away. You'll need to step aside for just a moment." She moved without waiting for his response, already redirecting the next guest with a brilliant smile and a hand gesture. They stepped aside. They waited. No one offered assistance. After 2 minutes, Rebecca returned, offering only a single word, "Resolved." Then she turned and gestured toward the aircraft without eye contact. "You can board now." As they stepped onto the plane, a man behind them scoffed, whispering just loud enough for Alandra to hear, "Don't know why they even bother with dress codes anymore. First class used to mean something." Alandra held Lyra's hand a little tighter. Dorian didn't turn around. He just kept walking. Dorian Alaric led his family down the jet bridge with a composed gait, his pace steady despite the discomfort that was beginning to brew just beneath his calm exterior. Alandra walked closely beside him, her grip firm on Lyra's small hand, her eyes scanning the polished walls and muted advertisements that lined the narrow passageway, not because she was interested in the glossy promotions, but because she needed a distraction from the way her body was tightening with unspoken frustration. When they finally stepped into the aircraft, the controlled climate and subdued lighting welcomed them with the kind of sterile luxury only first-class cabins could maintain. Cool leather, ivory accents, and the faint scent of bergamot and eucalyptus wafting from the air vents. But the comfort of the space was undermined instantly by the tone that greeted them. Rebecca Langley, who stood at the door with her corporate perfect posture and polished red lips, extended a clipboard toward Dorian with a smile that had all the warmth of frozen glass. "Before I direct you to your seats, sir, I'll need you to sign this waiver," she said, her voice low enough to sound like a courtesy but firm enough to register as non-negotiable. Dorian took the clipboard, glancing at the header, "Guest Acknowledgement of Non-Special Accommodation Agreement." He looked back at her without speaking. Alandra, who was already settling Lyra's bag into the crook of her elbow, turned her head sharply. "Excuse me." Rebecca's tone remained pleasant but impersonal. "It's just a standard document we ask certain passengers to complete. It affirms that you're not expecting dietary exceptions, mobility assistance, or any in-flight privileges beyond the base package. It protects both you and the crew from confusion." Dorian didn't sign immediately. His fingers hovered over the provided pen, his eyes flicking between the form and the other first-class passengers, none of whom were being handed anything. One man in a cashmere coat was escorted straight to a seat with a flute of chilled, sparkling water already waiting on the tray. Another woman with a high bun and pearl earrings was handed a hot towel by a junior attendant before she even sat down. Dorian looked at Rebecca again and said in a voice that refused to rise, "Is this being given to everyone?" She smiled more tightly. "Only to select passengers. It's situational." He signed. He had no choice. Saying no would only delay them, or worse, invite more humiliation in front of his daughter. As he handed the clipboard back, Rebecca nodded once and motioned them forward. Seats 3G and 3H. Right side, rear row of the Skylux cabin. No welcome aboard. No gesture of hospitality. Just that stiff, pointed instruction. As they moved past her, the couple immediately behind them, a middle-aged pair with sunburned cheeks and cruise line caps, were greeted with enthusiasm. "Mr. and Mrs. Delaney, welcome aboard. You're just 2 rows ahead, 1C and 1D. We've already chilled the Chardonnay for you." The contrast wasn't just visible, it was theatrical. As the Alarix walked down the narrow aisle between the high-walled suites of Skylux class, Elandra could feel the shift in atmosphere with every step. Eyes turned toward them but quickly flicked away, as if their presence created static in a signal everyone preferred to keep smooth. A man in a tailored charcoal suit briefly looked up from his Wall Street Journal, then subtly turned the page with just enough force to say, "This isn't the neighborhood I paid for." Lyra didn't notice. She was too focused on counting the number of windows on their side of the plane. Dorian lifted their carry-on into the overhead bin with slow precision, careful not to scuff the edges of the polished compartments, then helped Elandra ease into her seat. Rebecca approached moments later with a tray of drinks. Without breaking stride, she placed a single small plastic cup of still water on the armrest between Dorian and Elandra, then turned without asking for their preferences. A row ahead, another passenger was presented with a laminated cocktail menu. The Alarix said nothing. They simply settled in, adjusting seat belts and headrests, performing the rituals of travel like trained professionals who understood that silence, in this context, was the most effective defense against escalation. 20 minutes later, after the last of the passengers had boarded and the flight attendants were finishing their pre-departure checks, a young male steward passed by their row carrying a silver tray filled with gourmet snacks, brioche crackers, fig jam, prosciutto. When Lyra peeked up over her mother's lap, eyes wide at the neatly arranged food, the steward glanced down, hesitated, then muttered, "I'll be back." He didn't return. No explanation followed. Elandra leaned back in her seat, her fingers absently tracing the engraved logo on the seat buckle. She wasn't surprised. She was tired. Tired of unspoken exceptions. Of knowing that the price they paid bought them a seat, but never the full experience. Rebecca returned shortly before takeoff for one final inspection. As she passed their row, she paused, her gaze sweeping over their area. She reached into the compartment under Dorian's screen and pulled out a black leather menu envelope. She flipped it open, pretended to glance over it, then said, "Unfortunately, we're down to our limited menu on this flight. I'll circle back after I take care of the front row." She didn't mention that the front row had already ordered twice. Dorian exhaled slowly. He rested his elbow on the armrest and looked past his wife toward the window. Outside, the sun had begun to rise, casting streaks of amber and rose across the smooth concrete of the tarmac. Behind him, murmurs drifted through the cabin as the door sealed shut. Elandra reached for her seat's privacy divider and pulled it halfway up, not all the way, because to do so would feel like surrendering to invisibility, but enough to signal a desire for peace. Lyra leaned into her side and whispered, "Mom, why don't we get the juice like that man with the silver watch?" Elandra smiled, soft but firm. "Because we didn't ask fast enough." As the jet leveled at cruising altitude and the fastened seatbelt signs dimmed with a subtle chime, the energy inside the first-class cabin shifted from polite rigidity to quiet indulgence. The click of champagne flutes meeting tray tables, the rustle of luxury brand magazine pages turning, and the sound of low, practiced laughter from the forward rows formed a rhythm that wrapped the front cabin in its own elite symphony. One the Alaric family was allowed to observe, but never truly join. Dorian leaned his seat back slightly, trying to relax, though the rigid set of his shoulders refused to let go. Elandra remained upright, hands folded neatly in her lap, eyes fixed on the in-flight map, glowing softly from the screen across from her. She hadn't touched the blanket left at her seat. Beside her, Lyra sketched quietly in her coloring book, her head resting gently against her mother's arm. The silence between them wasn't hostile. It was heavy with endurance, the quiet strength that comes from knowing how to stay composed under scrutiny. The cabin crew moved through the aisles in pairs, offering refreshments, engaging some passengers in pleasant banter, and posing with others for what appeared to be an airline-sponsored photo series, part of a new Skylux Loyalty Highlights campaign being conducted mid-flight. Rebecca, of course, led the effort. She carried herself with the ease of someone who had rehearsed a performance many times over, smiling generously for selfies, holding a miniature champagne bottle in one hand and a branded placard in the other. "Another one for the VIP reel," she said to the passenger in 1A, a finance executive with an impeccable haircut and a Mont Blanc pen clipped to his shirt pocket. He laughed obligingly, holding up his flute of bubbly while Rebecca crouched beside him for the perfect angle. They moved on to a newlywed couple, then to a pair of elderly sisters traveling for their birthday, and then to a travel blogger who requested 2 different poses for variety. But when Rebecca passed row 3G and 3H, where the Alarics sat, she didn't stop. She didn't look. She didn't offer. It wasn't a mistake, it was a choice. Her smile faded by a fraction as she walked past them, her body angled just enough to block the photographer behind her from even glancing their way. Lyra looked up from her drawing, her voice small but clear. "Mommy, why didn't you take our picture too?" Elandra hesitated before answering, her voice calm but laced with steel. "Maybe they already have enough pictures, honey." Dorian said nothing, but his fingers curled around the edge of the armrest as he stared straight ahead. A moment later, the photographer circled back again. This time, he paused beside Rebecca and said, "I think we skipped that row. Should we go back?" Rebecca shook her head slightly, her voice low and clipped. "They're not part of a loyalty program." Then louder, with finality, "Let's move on." The message was clear to anyone within earshot. They didn't belong in the curated image of luxury the airline wanted to display. A few passengers glanced over curiously, but quickly returned to their magazines, their screens, or their cocktails. Moments later, the champagne cart rolled back through the aisle, glinting under the warm cabin lights. The attendant accompanying it wore an overly cheerful expression and a polished smile, offering the gold-labeled bottle with a practice script. "As part of our Skylux first experience, please enjoy our premium blend with notes of pear, white flowers, and almond. Pairs beautifully with the truffle bites." The guests in rows 1 and 2 received their flutes with gratitude and a toast. The young woman beside the window in 2A asked for seconds. When the cart reached row 3, the attendant hesitated, glanced at Rebecca, and then stopped short at 3G. Rebecca, who now stood just behind, placed her hand gently on the tray and leaned in toward the Alarics. "I'm sorry, but your booking doesn't include the champagne first upgrade," she said, her voice pleasant but firm. "May I offer still or sparkling water instead?" Elandra looked at her, eyes unmoving, then answered in a voice carefully measured. "Still is fine." Dorian said nothing. He simply watched Rebecca as she poured the water into a thin plastic cup, noticeably different from the stemmed glassware being used for other guests, and placed it on the tray table, as if fulfilling a reluctant obligation. The cart moved on. The clinking resumed. The performance continued. Later, when Lyra asked for a snack she'd seen others receive, one of the branded Skylux gourmet boxes with macadamia cookies and a tiny glass jar of honeyed almonds, Rebecca returned with a packet of salted pretzels and a forced smile. "We're out of the deluxe boxes," she claimed, "but these are a favorite too." Lyra stared at the plain packaging, confused, but said nothing. Dorian reached for the pretzels and held them between his thumb and index finger, then placed them in the seat pocket in front of him without opening the bag. No words were exchanged. None were needed. Elandra remained perfectly still, as if movement would somehow justify the treatment. Her hands rested on her lap. Her eyes no longer watched the map. She simply stared ahead, beyond the curtain at the front of the cabin, into the space where equality lived only as theory. The flight continued in quiet absurdity. When the lights dimmed for the pre-meal mood setting, the overhead reading lights above their seats remained unresponsive. When the attendant was called to assist, the reply came 10 minutes late. "Oh, that fixture's been glitchy lately. Nothing we can do, mid-flight." Dorian shifted slightly in his seat, legs crossed, eyes locked on the dark horizon beyond the window, while Elandra sat motionless beside him, her hands still gently resting over Lyra's lap as the child dozed off with her cheek pressed against her mother's side. Though they hadn't exchanged a word in nearly 20 minutes, the silence between them spoke volumes, filled with the unspoken understanding that the performance wasn't over. It was merely entering its second act. Just then, a different flight attendant, taller, younger, seemingly newer, walked briskly down the aisle, holding a tablet in one hand and scanning each row with the kind of exaggerated attentiveness that usually only occurred after a passenger had caused a problem. When he reached row 3G and 3H, where the Alarics sat, he paused, narrowed his eyes subtly, then glanced down at the screen. "Excuse me," he said, directing his voice just loud enough for neighboring passengers to hear. "I just want to make sure these are your assigned seats, correct?" Dorian turned to look at him without blinking. "That's correct." The attendant tapped his screen theatrically, then added, "No problem, just double-checking. We've had some mix-ups with upgrades lately. Some passengers think an empty seat is an open seat. You know how it is." His tone was light, but the implication was heavy and intentional. Elandra's expression didn't shift, but her fingers moved slightly, resting protectively over her daughter's hands. The attendant lingered a beat longer than necessary, then moved on, repeating none of this act with any other passenger. Across the aisle, a middle-aged man glanced over, eyebrows raised slightly, before returning to his film. A few minutes later, another member of the crew stopped at their row. This time, a woman in her 50s with a crisp bun and too much lipstick. She leaned in, as if concerned. "Is everything all right here? No complaints? No discomfort?" she asked in a syrupy voice that wasn't meant to soothe, but to signal, "We're watching you." Elandra smiled faintly and replied, "We're fine." The woman nodded, then crouched down slightly and glanced at their footrests, her fingers brushing along the base of the seats as if inspecting for contraband. "We've had some issues with this row in the past," she murmured more to herself than to them. "Sometimes people sit here without the correct ticket class. You'd be surprised what people try these days." She stood up, adjusted her jacket, and moved on without further explanation. Dorian's eyes followed her the entire way down the aisle, his hands folded tightly in his lap. He didn't speak, because speaking wouldn't shift the power dynamic. It would only paint a target bolder. Within seconds of her departure, the screens in front of them flickered to black. The cabin entertainment system, previously displaying flight progress and a rotating gallery of films, shut off without warning. Lyra stirred slightly at the flicker, murmured something about the cartoon she had been watching earlier, and looked up sleepily at the now blank screen. Dorian pressed the call button above his seat. The icon lit up, then blinked off a moment later, but no one came. 10 minutes passed. A steward eventually arrived, not Rebecca this time, but the same younger man who had questioned their seat assignment earlier. "Yes," he asked. Dorian gestured calmly at the screens. "Our system went out." The attendant leaned over to check, poked at the side panel with unnecessary force, then stood up. "Strange. Must be a glitch in the seat unit." He tapped something into his tablet. "It happens sometimes with older rows, especially when there's been firmware updates." "Can it be reset?" Elandra asked, her tone polite but cool. He shook his head. "Unfortunately, mid-flight system resets disable the whole row's connectivity, so it's usually better to wait until landing. I can bring an in-flight magazine if you'd like." Elandra declined with a faint nod. The steward left. A minute later, the child in the row ahead reclined her seat and turned up the volume on her movie. Laughter spilled from her screen. Lyra glanced up again at her own lifeless monitor and said, "Why did our screen go away?" Alandra hesitated. "Maybe it needs rest just like we do," she said softly. Lyra frowned, then settled back against her mother's side. For the next hour, the Alarix sat in silence as other passengers laughed, scrolled, and ordered another round of drinks. The staff did not return to offer a fix. They did not return to apologize. They did not return at all. During the dinner service, Rebecca reappeared, announcing cheerfully, "We'll be serving from the exclusive chef's menu this evening. I hope everyone's ready for something special." When she reached row 3, her tray noticeably lighter, she knelt beside them and said, "Due to an inventory error, we only have the standard selection available for this row." Dorian didn't answer. Alandra offered a simple, "We'll take whatever's available." The entree was lukewarm pasta, served in a plastic tray without garnish. Others around them dined on seared salmon with citrus glaze and foie gras on porcelain dishes. The artificial stillness of the first-class cabin remained unbroken for the next hour, but within the Alarix row, that silence had shifted from the quiet of endurance to the weight of forced invisibility. Dorian adjusted his seat slightly, attempting to ease the stiffness building in his spine, though no position could quite remove the pressure that came from being observed and dismissed at the same time. Alandra remained composed, her eyes fixed on the static screen ahead, while Lyra had drifted off again, curled beneath the thinner blanket they had been given, the same one that lacked the embroidered trim present on every other seat in their section. Around them, passengers reclined comfortably, sipping cognac, chuckling at late-night talk shows on their personal screens, and requesting just a splash more sparkling without hesitation. Dorian didn't look at them, but he heard everything. He always did. At precisely 8:37 p.m., a man seated in 2A, an older gentleman with silver hair, a Rolex the size of a golf ball, and a subtle New England accent, called out in a voice just loud enough to travel 2 rows back, "Excuse me, but the glare from a window behind me is a bit much. Would someone mind adjusting it?" Rebecca Langley emerged from the galley in under 10 seconds, her hair still perfectly sculpted and her voice dipped in honey. "Of course, Mr. Wentham," she replied with performative grace, scanning the area. She looked to the right, toward the window that was casting the golden glow across the man's seat. That window belonged to the Alarix row. More specifically, it was directly beside Lyra, who lay with her head tilted toward it, the last bit of sunlight resting gently over her curls. Without hesitation, Rebecca stepped beside their row and bent forward, her arm reaching toward the shade. "I'm going to need to bring this down," she announced, not requesting but asserting. Alandra moved slightly, unsure whether to speak. "She's asleep," she offered gently, nodding toward her daughter. "The light's not direct." Rebecca's hand froze for only half a second before continuing its motion, drawing the shade down with a swift tug. "Yes, but it's disrupting other passengers," she said, straightening. "Thank you for your understanding." She didn't make eye contact. She didn't offer an apology. She simply walked away, her heels clicking softly on the carpet. Dorian turned his gaze toward the now darkened window, then to his daughter, whose head shifted slightly as the warmth was stolen from her cheek. He didn't speak, because what would he say? That the light had been there for everyone? That other windows remained open? That it was the second time tonight they had been corrected for someone else's comfort? That this wasn't about light at all, but about erasure? There would be no acceptable version of that truth, not in this cabin, not from someone like him. 10 minutes later, Rebecca returned for another round of meal prep, this time carrying a second tablet used for menu selection. She stopped at each row with a polished sequence, a bright smile, a short summary of options, a question about dietary restrictions, a friendly chef recommends the halibut, or the fillet is flown in fresh. She arrived at the Alarix row with the same smile, but it faltered just slightly as she leaned down to Dorian's side. Her voice dropped lower, just out of range from others. "Just so you're aware, our premium meal selections are limited, and we typically prioritize long-term loyalty members. You may want to temper expectations accordingly." Dorian looked up slowly, his posture unchanged. "We'll take whatever is available," he said, "as long as it's served equally." Rebecca's lips curled slightly, her tone cool and condescending. "Of course," she said. Then, as if unable to resist, she added with a whisper that sliced beneath the surface, "You know, sometimes money buys a seat, but not the right kind of presence." Her words hung in the air like smoke, soft, but choking. Elandra, who had heard the entire exchange, turned her face away. Not out of weakness, but out of preservation. She had learned long ago that some battles were not worth fighting, not because they weren't real, but because they were designed for you to lose the moment you raised your voice. Rebecca walked away before a response could come, already rehearsing the next greeting for the businessman in 4A. Lyra stirred again, and Elandra began humming softly, an old lullaby passed down through generations, one her mother used to sing during thunderstorms. It wasn't for comfort, it was for grounding. She needed something familiar, something that belonged to her, untouched by outside judgment. As the crew began serving the chosen dishes to the other passengers, salmon with lemon beurre blanc, duck confit, lamb tagine plated with truffle polenta, the Alaric's waited. No one came. Their food arrived 10 minutes late, unceremoniously placed on their tray tables without garnish, without explanation, without even a glance. They ate in silence, not because they weren't hungry, but because they had grown accustomed to swallowing more than just food. When Lyra quietly asked if she could have a cookie like the girl in 2B, Elandra kissed her forehead and said, "I'll find you one when we land." The lie was soft, but necessary. Across the aisle, another passenger asked for his third glass of wine. It was delivered with a laugh. At 10:02 p.m., the cabin lights dimmed for rest. Rebecca passed through the aisle one final time, offering eye masks and silk travel blankets to select guests. The Alarics received nothing. As the curtain closed between first class and the rest of the aircraft, the sound of the cabin narrowed into a contained hush. Dorian looked out at the window Rebecca had earlier closed. The cabin settled into its artificial nighttime rhythm, the lights dimmed to soft amber, and a pre-recorded playlist of smooth jazz hummed through the overhead speakers as passengers stretched their legs, reclined in silence, and prepared for the long coast over the Atlantic. The air was hushed but not peaceful. In row 3G and 3H, peace had long since been stripped down to politeness, and politeness now existed only as armor. Dorian sat with his arms folded, staring at the blank screen in front of him while Elandra gently rubbed Lyra's back, coaxing her into sleep again after yet another minor disruption. A tray that had been dropped nearby, a crew member who had stumbled too close to their row and muttered a vague apology before moving on without stopping. A short while later, the crew returned with the evening amenities. A new tray rolled out, neatly organized with plush neck pillows, fleece travel blankets, and over-ear noise-canceling headphones embroidered with the Ether Air insignia. Rebecca, once again at the helm of distribution, stopped at each row with calculated efficiency, lowering her voice into the practiced murmur of exclusivity, her words punctuated with smiles that reached only her cheekbones. "Here's your Skylux audio kit. Enjoy your film in style," she cooed to the elderly couple in 1C and 1D. "Two sets for you, Mr. Henderson. Your upgrade covers premium comfort," she told the man in 2A. But when she arrived at the Alaric's row, her smile vanished, replaced by the neutral expression of protocol. She tapped her tablet, glanced briefly at Dorian, then Elandra, then stated simply, "Unfortunately, your tier does not qualify for the Skylux audio package. Would you prefer standard earbuds instead?" Dorian remained silent. Elandra didn't even look up. Rebecca didn't wait for a response. She set down a pair of flimsy plastic-wrapped earbuds, low-quality, tangle-prone, and jarringly inconsistent with the otherwise immaculate service elsewhere in the cabin. She didn't offer the travel blanket. She didn't explain. She simply moved on. Dorian took the earbuds and placed them on the tray table, untouched. He didn't need to open the package to know they would produce hollow sound and carry more insult than audio. Across the aisle, a woman leaned into her reclined seat, luxuriating in the over-ear headphones, adjusting the plush headrest behind her neck, while watching a romantic comedy with the clarity of surround sound. Minutes later, a new attendant, A man with a crisp uniform and nervous energy approached the Alaric's row carrying a thin folder and a stylus. "Mr. and Mrs. Alaric," he asked quietly, glancing between them. "We'd like to request your signature on a standard compliance document. It's a voluntary agreement we ask select passengers to sign when media attention is a concern." Elandra looked up sharply, though her voice remained even. "What sort of media attention?" The man's hands twitched slightly as he passed over the folder. "It's just a simple form confirming you won't record any part of the flight crew or cabin interior without prior permission. It's for everyone's safety." Dorian raised an eyebrow. "We've already agreed to the airline's terms of service when we booked," he said. "Does this form apply to all passengers or just certain rows?" The attendant hesitated, choosing his next words with visible effort. "It's discretionary. High-profile flights, you understand." "And who made the discretion?" Elandra asked, her voice now quiet but unmistakably sharpened. "Your supervisor?" "No, ma'am," the attendant replied quickly. "The lead flight attendant instructed it." Dorian opened the folder, scanning the brief page of legal language. The wording was vague but pointed. It did not prohibit all filming, only filming of staff, service quality, or passenger interactions. There was no mention of this form in the airline's official policy. The message was unmistakable. "Do not record us. Do not prove this happened." He closed the folder and returned it and signed. "We'll be declining," he said simply. The attendant looked anxious but nodded. "Understood. I'll inform her." He disappeared behind the curtain, and for a moment the aisle was quiet again. But not for long. Rebecca returned within 5 minutes, this time without a clipboard. Her arms crossed more tightly than usual, her smile absent entirely. "I understand there's some hesitation with the compliance form," she said, her voice polite on the surface but edged with threat. Dorian turned his head slowly. "That's correct. I assure you it's for everyone's protection," she added, gesturing vaguely to the other passengers. "You wouldn't want to be misunderstood later." Elandra responded without blinking. "We're not recording anything, and we're not signing anything that singles us out under the guise of protection." Rebecca looked as though she might push again, but something in Elandra's gaze stopped her. She nodded once, too sharply, and walked away. Nothing more was said, but nothing needed to be. From that moment onward, the curtain between the Alarics and the rest of the crew may as well have been made of steel. The dinner trays were cleared later than the rest. The refills never came. When Dorian pressed the call button to request a water bottle for Lyra, now fully asleep but with lips slightly dry, no one answered. After 17 minutes, he stood up and retrieved one himself from the galley fridge, where 2 crew members stepped aside without meeting his eyes. When he returned, Elandra was still seated, her face unreadable, her hands still in her lap. "They don't want a scene," she said quietly. "As he Saturday, they just want the evidence gone before we land." "They won't get it," Dorian replied. The plane had settled into a nighttime lull, and the hush across the Skylux cabin had grown deeper, not just from sleep, but from comfort, an exclusive kind of ease that came from knowing you were at the center of a system built to cater to your comfort. But row 3G and 3H had no such ease. In that row, the silence wasn't peace, it was pressure. It was a blanket laid over disappointment, humiliation, and the desperate need to remain composed for just a little longer. Lyra, who had woken again after a brief nap, now sat upright and alert, her eyes catching the motion of a flight attendant handing out branded Ether Air sticker sheets to children scattered across the cabin. The stickers came in shiny packs, adorned with colorful jets, cartoon pilots, and glittered wing badges. The little boy across the aisle received his with delight, peeling them one by one and showing his mother with joy. Lyra, curious and hopeful, tapped her mother's arm and pointed. "Can I get a sticker too?" she asked, voice bright with the kind of innocence only children possess. Hopeful, unaware, still believing kindness came without calculation. Elandra looked toward Rebecca, who was 2 rows ahead, speaking with another family. She hesitated. Asking again would mean inviting another moment. But before she could speak, Lyra, unable to contain her anticipation, raised her hand slightly and called out, "Excuse me, "Can I have a sticker too, please?" Rebecca turned slowly, her expression unreadable. She reached into her side satchel, rummaged for a moment, and pulled out a single sticker, creased, half-peeled at the edge, its color slightly faded. She walked to Lyra's seat and handed it over without ceremony. "Here you go," she said flatly. No smile, no words of delight, just emotion and a retreat. Lyra took the sticker, looking at it with visible confusion. She turned it over in her hands, clearly wondering why hers looked different. Moments later, Rebecca walked back down the aisle and stopped at row 2C, where another child had just stirred from sleep. "We didn't get one earlier," the boy's mother said. "Could he have a sticker too?" Rebecca smiled, reached into the same satchel, and retrieved a brand new sticker sheet, glossy and intact, then knelt beside the child with a cheery, "Of course you can. These are our favorites." Elandra saw everything. So did Dorian. Neither spoke. Lyra slowly tucked the worn sticker into her coloring book and said nothing. It would have been easier if the slight had been loud, if someone had snapped at them, shoved their tray, or raised a voice. But this was more exhausting. This was precise. This was crafted. And this was not the end. Later, as the second round of drink service moved through the cabin, passengers were offered another beverage of choice. Most opted for decaf coffee or herbal tea. Some requested a nightcap, whiskey, port, a final splash of Cabernet. Rebecca and the junior attendant moved efficiently, stopping at each row, confirming preferences, taking light requests with a kind of charm that softened the final stretch of a long flight. When they reached the Alaric's row, Rebecca paused, glanced down at her tablet, and then stepped past them. No inquiry, no offer, no eye contact, just silence. 10 minutes later, the same junior attendant returned to offer a refill to the man across the aisle, a second round. As she poured, the man leaned toward her and murmured something. His voice wasn't loud, but it was clear enough to carry. "Has that lady in 3H even been served once tonight?" he asked, eyes narrowing slightly. "Seems like she's just waiting." The attendant hesitated, caught off guard. She didn't answer. Rebecca, who had overheard from 3 rows back, turned her head just slightly. Her expression didn't flicker. She walked away. No response. No correction. Just deliberate omission. Dorian, still sitting upright, heard the exchange. He said nothing. Elandra continued staring straight ahead, one hand now resting protectively on Lyra's knee. In that moment, it wasn't just about being skipped. It was about being seen skipped, about having that act witnessed and still left unresolved. The kind of injustice that was quiet enough to avoid a scandal, but loud enough to scar. The final round of hot towels came before descent. Rebecca handed one to each passenger in the first 2 rows, smiling, reminding them to refresh before arrival. When she passed the Alaric's again, she held a tray with 3 towels and glanced down. For the first time, her eyes met Dorian's. She held his gaze for less than 2 seconds, then continued walking and handed the remaining towels to the couple behind them. It wasn't an oversight. It wasn't a mistake. It was a statement. And everyone in their section had started to feel it. Silence spread again, but this time it wasn't calm. It was unease. Not from the Alaric's, but from the others. Something was wrong, and people knew it, even if they couldn't name it yet. Even if they didn't dare address it. Even if they told themselves it was better to say nothing. Lyra finally whispered, "Is it almost time to land?" Dorian sat with his back straight, shoulders taut, as if his body refused to surrender to gravity or the mood of the room. Elandra, still upright beside him, had stopped trying to sleep. She didn't close her eyes, because even in darkness, she knew what dismissal felt like. Lyra lay curled across both their laps now, gently snoring, one sticker still clutched loosely in her hand. When the fastened seatbelt light blinked off again, Dorian stood. He did it as quietly as possible, sliding his arm out from beneath his daughter's back, nodding once to his wife, then stepping out into the aisle toward the lavatory at the front of the first-class cabin. As he moved, the black leather document folio he had wedged into the side of his seat shifted slightly, then slipped, then dropped to the floor without a sound. It landed right in the aisle, flat, unremarkable, mostly unnoticed, except by one person. 4 rows up, A curious boy of about 10 years old had been fidgeting in his seat, bored of cartoons. His screen paused, his parents half asleep beside him. The drop caught his attention. Without hesitation, he slipped from his chair, darted into the aisle, picked up the folder, and opened the flap before anyone could stop him. What he saw inside made him freeze. A sharp, bold letterhead embossed on thick stock paper read, Dorian M., Alaric Executive Chairman, Ether Air Holdings. Beneath it was a contract draft, partially visible, stamped with confidential in red. The boy's eyes widened. He didn't understand everything he was looking at, but he understood enough. He turned toward his father, still holding the folder up like a trophy. Dad, this guy dropped this. Is he the boss of the plane? His voice rang through the cabin like a struck bell. Not loud, but unmistakably clear in the hush of mid-flight. His father stirred awake, blinking in confusion as he reached out to take the folder, pulling it away from his son gently. He turned it over, opened it halfway, then froze when his eyes landed on the letterhead. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. He turned to the passenger seated beside him, a man with a tablet still open to a financial dashboard, and asked under his breath, "Have you heard of Dorian Alaric?" The man frowned, leaned over, and read the name. His eyes narrowed. "Yeah," he said slowly. "I think, yes. I saw him last quarter on a live stream. He runs the holding group. He's the guy above the airline." The boy, now fidgeting with excitement, pointed toward row 3G. "That's him." He dropped it. By then, Dorian was returning from the restroom. His walk was casual, unaware of the ripple spreading ahead of him. As he approached, the father of the boy stood up and stepped into the aisle. He offered the folder with both hands, respectful but astonished. "Mr. Alaric," he said carefully, "you dropped this." Dorian paused. His eyes flicked to the folder, then to the man, then to the boy. His expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture, a tiny adjustment in the shoulders, a narrowing of his eyes. He nodded once and accepted the folder. "Thank you." He didn't confirm or deny anything. He simply returned to his seat. But the damage, or rather, the revelation, was done. People had heard, people had seen, and people had begun to whisper. The man with the financial dashboard leaned across the aisle to speak to another passenger. "That's Dorian Alaric," he murmured. "That family, row 3, they've been mistreated the entire flight." "Wait," said the other. "You mean the Alarics? I thought he was just a passenger." "He is," the man replied. "He's also the man signing checks for this entire operation." More murmurs followed. One woman took out her phone, opened a browser, and typed Dorian Alaric Ether Air. The top result was a Forbes profile. Another was a Bloomberg interview. Another showed a press release from the airline's boardroom reorganization. The image in the article? The man now seated calmly in 3G, arms folded again, eyes straight ahead. The whispers turned into stares. Not from the Alarics, but at them, and at the crew. The businessman who had verified Dorian's identity stood from his seat, leaned toward an attendant, and said, "I think you're going to want to tell your lead that she's made a serious mistake." The attendant blinked, confused. "Sir, you've ignored and humiliated the executive chairman of your own airline," he said. "I don't think that's a service issue. I think that's a scandal." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Around him, others had begun connecting the dots. The child with the crumpled sticker. Dorian Alaric had returned to his seat with the composure of a man used to holding the weight of silence. But silence could only protect so much, and it was no longer only his. The folder had been seen. The name had been read. The whispers had become ripples, and those ripples were now slamming against the sides of the cabin, forming waves of recognition and moral clarity. People knew, and they were beginning to choose what they would do with that knowledge. The businessman in row 2D, the one who had verified Dorian's identity, stood again, his voice calm but audible as he called toward the aisle. "Excuse me, miss." Rebecca Langley, who had just emerged from the galley carrying a tray of hot towels, turned with her professional half-smile still frozen on her face. "Yes, sir?" "Do you know who is sitting in row 3G?" he asked, loud enough for surrounding passengers to hear. Rebecca's eyes flicked back, scanning the row. She didn't recognize the face for what it was. All she saw was the same man she had been selectively overlooking the entire flight. She replied with clipped certainty, "A family who needed a few reminders about our first-class policies." The businessman's eyebrows lifted. His voice stayed low, but it landed like a gavel. "That's Dorian Alaric. He's the executive chairman of this airline's parent company. He doesn't follow your rules. He writes them." The words struck like thunder in a quiet church. A murmur rolled through the seats, soft gasps, quick exhales, a sudden stillness that signaled something irreversible had just occurred. Rebecca blinked. I wasn't informed," she began, her voice uncertain now, her grip on the towel tray tightening. "No," the man cut her off, still calm, still surgical. "But you were informed when you chose who to smile at, who to serve, who to humiliate. Don't act surprised now that you've discovered who you've been ignoring." Rebecca opened her mouth again, but she didn't speak. Her breath was caught between denial and disbelief, caught in the realization that the performance she had so confidently orchestrated for the last 6 hours was crumbling in front of the very person who could write her out of the script entirely. And then, the final sound that shattered whatever illusion remained. A low chime from the intercom, followed by a clipped, professional male voice echoing through the cabin. "Lead Flight Attendant Rebecca Langley, please report immediately to the forward service galley. This is a directive from corporate operations." The cabin went silent. The businessman slowly sat back down. Rebecca stood frozen in the aisle, eyes wide, hands unmoving. The tray in her arms trembled slightly. Behind her, Melissa, the younger flight attendant, peeked out from the galley curtain, her expression tight with worry. Rebecca looked around the cabin. The same people who had ignored her slights, laughed at her jokes, and clinked glasses in her presence were now watching her with the kind of detachment reserved for live executions, disbelief, disappointment, and just enough curiosity to keep their attention fixed. She turned without a word and walked toward the front, her heels clicking on the carpet, her posture trying to remain composed but failing under the weight of what she now knew. She had misjudged everything. At row 3G, Dorian remained silent. He didn't glance at her. He didn't nod. He didn't react. Elandra looked down at Lyra, gently tucking a blanket over her as the child slept. They had not stood, had not pointed, had not shouted. And yet, the truth had risen. Rebecca disappeared through the curtain. Melissa hesitated, then stepped fully into the aisle and began quietly collecting the hot towels from the tray Rebecca had left behind. She didn't speak, but her hands moved faster, more carefully, as if she now understood that every gesture had weight. Across the aisle, another woman pulled out her phone and whispered, "I knew something was off." Her husband nodded, lips pressed tight. They didn't just mistreat them. They silenced them. "Try to," his wife corrected. But not anymore. 15 minutes passed. No announcement followed. No apology came. But something far more powerful had arrived. Awareness. Collective, inescapable awareness. And that, unlike branded champagne or gourmet menus, could not be curated or denied. The minutes that followed Rebecca's departure into the forward galley stretched long and taut, each second weighed down by what it carried. Expectation, uncertainty, and a growing current of reckoning. No one in the Skylux cabin returned to their previous distractions. Screens were paused, magazines held mid-page, drinks left untouched. Even the quietest passengers leaned slightly forward in their seats, eyes occasionally flicking toward the curtain she had vanished behind, waiting not just for her return, but for the judgment that would come with it. In row 3G, Dorian remained still, composed, with his fingers gently resting over Lyra's blanket as she slept beside him, unaware of a storm she had slept through. Elandra sat with the same posture she had held since boarding, elegant, upright, unmoved by spectacle, but every inch of her radiating a calm that now felt more like command than endurance. When the curtain finally parted again, it wasn't Rebecca who stepped out first. It was Melissa. Her expression had changed, not fearful, not confused, but resolute, like someone who had been asked to carry something heavy and had chosen to accept it. She took a breath, squared her shoulders, and addressed the cabin in a clear voice. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, effective immediately, lead flight attendant Rebecca Langley has been relieved of duty for the remainder of this flight. A hush fell over the cabin, not from surprise, but from confirmation. No one gasped. No one interrupted, because by now they all knew. Melissa continued, "Any service needs or concerns will now be handled by myself and the remaining crew." She offered a short bow of her head, then stepped to the side. Behind her, Rebecca emerged, but she was no longer the same. Her name badge had been removed. Her blazer was slightly rumpled, and for the first time since the flight began, her face showed cracks in the carefully crafted performance. She didn't make eye contact. She didn't speak. She walked past the rows of passengers with measured steps, but each movement seemed heavier than the last. When she reached row 3G, she paused briefly, just a breath of hesitation. But Dorian did not look up. Alandra didn't flinch. And Lyra, still asleep, clutched the fresh sticker Melissa had quietly brought her moments earlier. Colorful, shiny, uncreased. Rebecca moved on. She disappeared into the rear galley without a word. And then, the cabin exhaled. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it was real. People shifted in their seats. Shoulders dropped. Glances were exchanged. Across the aisle, the businessman who had spoken up earlier turned toward Dorian and gave him a quiet nod, not one of pity, but of respect. And then, with a curious expression, he asked the question many had likely been thinking. "If you don't mind me asking," he said in a low voice, "why didn't you say anything earlier?" Dorian looked at him for a long second, not annoyed, not offended, just thoughtful. Then he offered a small smile, calm and grounded. "Because when power speaks too soon," he said, "people call it arrogance. But when truth speaks at the right time, people call it justice." The man nodded slowly, absorbing it. "Fair enough. Besides," Dorian added, glancing toward the front of the cabin where the curtain had closed again, "some lessons don't land until people see them for themselves." Behind him, another passenger quietly took out her phone, deleted the video she had started recording earlier. "No need," she whispered to her husband. This already landed." At that moment, the intercom clicked on one last time. It was the captain. His voice was warm, steady, deliberate. "Ladies and gentlemen, as we begin our descent into Montreal, we'd like to thank you for choosing Ether Air. We'd also like to acknowledge that tonight's flight may have been unusual for some. On behalf of our company, we remain committed to a standard of respect and service that extends to every passenger in every seat. Thank you for your patience." The message was vague. It made no direct reference, but everyone in the cabin understood what it meant. The wheels were already turning. The course had already been corrected. The Alarix did not speak as the plane descended, nor when the wheels touched down and the cabin erupted into the usual symphony of beeps, clicks, and stretch-induced groans. They remained seated, letting the other passengers move first, as they always had. But this time, the silence around them had changed. No longer sharp, no longer condescending. This silence carried weight, acknowledgement, maybe even a trace of shame. As the Alarix stepped off the plane, Melissa waited at the exit. She looked to Dorian, then to Alandra, and whispered, "I'm sorry. For everything." Alandra offered a kind, quiet nod. Dorian said, "What matters is what you do next." Melissa nodded back, eyes steady, and didn't look away. As they exited the jet bridge and stepped into the terminal, a man in a suit approached from a far end. He wore a lanyard with the Ether Air crest and a headset clipped to his collar. He stopped just short of Dorian and extended a hand. "Mr. Alarix, sir. Corporate is ready for your briefing. But we can delay if you'd prefer time with your family." Dorian shook his hand and replied, "They've waited long enough. We'll speak now." He turned to Alandra, who simply smiled and said, "I'll get Lyra a croissant." "Chocolate," Lyra murmured sleepily. Dorian chuckled softly, kissed her forehead, then walked away with the executive. The end. If this moment hit you as hard as it did us, tap that like button so more people see what quiet strength really looks like. Don't forget to subscribe. This is just one of many stories that demand to be told. Now tell us in the comments, which part of this story gave you chills? And hey, where in the world are you watching from right now? Let's see how far this message reaches.